I want to welcome everybody here today. Thank you for joining us. I'm glad you're able to join us in our second seminar. I didn't realize that. Today we have presenting Craig Dorschel. He has been a member of the American Rose Society since 1998. He's a Consulting Rosarian since 2003 and a Master Rosarian since 2013. He's been a Horticulture Judge since 2003 and an Arrangement Judge since 2012. He's a resident of Worcester, Massachusetts. Craig cares for over 120 roses in his garden and is a member of multiple local rose societies and the Yankee District. I also would like to say before we get Craig talking, when you do register, please do one favor. Make sure you're indicating the district that you're in. That way we can get the information to your district chair so they can know that you get credit for it. If you have questions about if you rather receive credit, I definitely want to tell you reach out to your district chair of horticulture judging, not with the ARS headquarters, so that you can find out if you were able to get credit. If you do need any help passed in, or they should need any information, we'll make sure that they get it. Thank you for being here, and I'll hand it over to Craig. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's afternoon everywhere in the 48 states. I see a couple names from the UK, so good evening to you. If anyone was from Hawaii, good morning to you. The schedule for the next few weeks is up on my screen, which I hopefully you're all seeing. Today's talk will be starting in a few minutes. Next week, Curtis Allmiller will be presenting a seminar on judging rose photography back at the 2 o'clock Eastern time hour. And then the final seminar will be from the West Coast for a change by Suzanne Horn on judging shrubs, climbers, polyanthus, and old garden roses. That will be at 2 p.m. It should say Eastern Standard Time at this point with the time change on November 1st. So with that, here's my title slide. You'll see that the title is a bit cryptic, and that will be clear in a few moments, but I didn't realize it. Some thoughts on horticulture judging and exhibiting. What I'm going to be talking about, first of all, is balance and proportion, that line on the scorecard. I'm going to talk about sprays, in particular the form of the spray as opposed to the form of the florets in the spray, and how balance and proportion pertains to sprays. And I'm going to be finishing up with talking about some aspects of the challenge classes, in particular the English box, the rose bowl, the floating rose, the cycle of bloom briefly, bowl collections such as the Seville and Lawton trophy classes, and finally staging of multi-stem entries, which I'm going to call arrays of roses. I promise not to talk about arrangements in case anybody was a little worried about that. So we're going to start off with balance and proportion. Balance and proportion is one of the prime elements of horticulture judging. I think we're all aware of that. It is worth only 10 of the 100 points. And I dare say that many decisions on what award goes to what rose is based on the first 3 or 4 items in the list: the form, color, and substance, which are all about the flower, and the stem and foliage, which are about the quality of the stem and foliage. Balance and proportion is sometimes discussed. I would say size is rarely discussed, but I think there's more to it that balance and proportion that merits some attention. The book says that balance and proportion is that physical property of a rose specimen that combines the relative sizes of bloom, stem, and foliage into an aesthetically pleasing exhibit. Stem length is of critical importance. I highlighted relative sizes in red because that's the direction that I'm going. I highlighted stem and length that's of critical importance in black because too often that's the only consideration that's given under balance and proportion, and it really is more than that. Then there's a couple of other interesting statements. Balance and proportion, like beauty itself, is in the eye of the beholder, and balance and proportion involves an acquired value judgment, one attribute that makes judging an art, etc., etc. They're saying that, in a sense, the judge has to be a bit of an art critic as well as making objective decisions on the roses. So let's look into that. The factors that come into balance of proportion are, first of all, the size of the flower, and I would say that's primary, and the length of the stem. We've already established that. We could say the thickness of the stem, and you're thinking, what? But a big flower on a skinny, weak stem is not going to look so good. The size of the foliage. You've probably heard Bruce Monroe talk about the days when there was a firm requirement for a 5-leaflet leaf on a specimen as opposed to a 3-leaflet leaf. It will certainly affect the size of the foliage. A 5-leaflet is bigger than a 3-leaflet. We'll be saying more about that. But all 4 of these are things that you can get out your ruler and measure. They are objective quantities. The amount of foliage, well, the number of leaves on a stem, it can be an appropriate number. It could possibly be too few. And how it's distributed along the stem, and we'll say more about that. And then you have to consider the relationship of all these factors to one another. So I want to start off now with some definitions. I'm going to define balance in a somewhat different way than it's used on the line balance and proportion, and hopefully that won't be too confusing, and I'll explain more about that. But I'm going to simply say that balance is visual and physical stability of a specimen. The rose in the container is a specimen. Proportion, the relation of length, area, or volume, I can say size or amount of one part of a specimen to another, or to one part to the whole. So there's balance of proportion, 2 words. Under balance of proportion in the horticulture guidelines, we say that something is balanced if the proportions are good. So it's used in a slightly different sense there. I think there's one more definition that comes in, and that's scale. Scale is the visual size relationship of each part of a specimen to each other part. Sounds a little strange, but if you think about that, I said the size of the rose is paramount. So the size of the rose establishes a scale for the specimen, and then the size of the leaves, the length and thickness of the stem, et cetera, all need to be in accord with that scale established by the rose to have a satisfactory proportion. And I'm going to make one more definition quick, is container. Since that's a word used often by arrangers, I don't want anybody to get nervous. The container is simply the vessel that holds the specimen. All vases are containers, not all containers are vases. English box, test tubes, those little plastic gadgets with a plastic tube on it for miniatures, bowls, those are all containers. They're not vases. So I'm going to use the word container throughout the rest of the talk. Now, gasp, balance, proportion, and scale are actually 3 items on the list of what are known as the principles of design. Okay, time out before anybody gets nervous. I didn't lie. I said I wouldn't talk about arrangements. I did not say that I wouldn't talk about design, especially as it applies to horticulture specimens and judging. And the subject of the design I'm going to try and establish is far more than flower arrangements or ladies' couture. In fact, it applies to almost everything. So, designers and persistence, I'm going to try and prove that. Besides liking roses, I like cars. So, if you know something about how cars are sold and are generated by their manufacturers, you know that they fuss about as much about how a car looks as about how well it runs. So design is important there. And I'm going to roll the clock back to 1953 to demonstrate this. So here's a typical 1953 American car. It's a 1953 Chrysler Windsor. Anyone who was around during the 50s would say, yeah, that's an early 50s car. It carries forward a lot of the design cues from earlier times, like the bulgy hood and the general bulky look of the thing, a lot of chrome and so forth. So, okay, that's typical. But design paradigms can change, and they can change dramatically, as in this example. which is a 1953 Studebaker Starliner coupe. Now, by comparison, the Studebaker looks aerodynamic, it looks low, it looks sleek. It looks like it would be faster than the Chrysler. I'm not sure whether that was true or not, and certainly neither of them are speed demons by today's standard. But what would grab your eye's attention if you had the two parked side by side? I'm going to think, especially nowadays, that it would be the Studi. Now, the Studebaker coupe was known for a long time as the Lowy coupe. So I want to give credit to the actual designer, who was a man named Robert Bork, but he was an employee of Lowy and Associates. So who is this Lowy fellow? Well, Raymond Lowy, who was a long-lived gentleman, was the premier industrial designer of the mid-20th century. He's famous for any number of things, from a streamlined pencil sharpener to a Gestetner duplicating machine, to corporate logos for Shell, Exxon, and the U.S. Postal Service, for cigarette packages, and the list goes on and on. But one thing he's particularly famous for was designing locomotives for the Pennsylvania Railroad when they wanted something sleek to go with their crack New York to Chicago passenger train, the Broadway Limited, and he came through. So here's a picture of Mr. Lowy standing on the locomotive he designed, as opposed to the one behind him, which is a regular old steam locomotive. Now, both of those would get you from point A to point B, but the Lowy design would get you there in style. And here's another picture of another in the series, and that was really a classic back in the 1930s, and I guess still is to railroad paths. So, okay, that's design, and I would say that that's pretty macho, so we will proceed. So going back to the factors of balance and proportion, we have the size of the flower, which establishes the scale. We want to see that the length of the stem, the thickness of the stem, the size of the foliage all are in accord with that. We look at the amount of foliage. If there's only a couple leaves on the stem, proportion of foliage to the rest of it would be out of kilter, according to our aesthetic principles. Distribution, we'll get back to in a moment, but you consider the relationship of these factors and one of those to determine whether overall there's good balance and proportion. How does balance in the design sense factor in? Well, it gets interesting. Suppose there's a leaf missing on one side of the stem. Now, I'm sure that's never happened to anybody, right? That a leaf got broken in transport. Yeah, right. Okay, when that happens, if you look at the specimen from the side, that missing leaf makes the specimen visually unbalanced to a degree. So that's an issue to consider. And we don't judge containers, and I want to make that absolutely clear. But, and it's a but, if you put a small rose in a big container, like it's a little polyanthus spray, and it's in a container that you would normally put a hybrid tea specimen in, the thing is going to look bottom heavy, and it's visually unbalanced, even though we couldn't deduct points for that, but it's still visually unbalanced. And the converse, if we have a little container with a big rose in it, a big mini florist spray, say in a container that would normally have a miniature rose in it, it not only looks top heavy and is visually unbalanced, and it could actually tip over and be physically unbalanced. So the moral of the story is, if there's flexibility in the use of containers, take advantage of it to try and avoid these situations. Which brings us to another interlude here about big roses and little roses. Miniature and mini flora roses tend to occupy a separate category to themselves. After all, they have their own containers, they have their own smaller entry tags, they even have their own national show where they're the only roses there. So in the minds of many people, these are quote unquote little roses. Ergo, everything else must then be a big rose. And the big roses have their own containers and they have their own empty tags. Of course, they feature in every show except the National Mini Show. But, and there's always a but, isn't there? Some mini floras, for example, are pretty big. They're almost as big as floribundas. And some of these so-called big roses are actually pretty small. Thinking of polyanthus, I'm thinking some of the shrubs, some of the old garden roses, for example. How on earth did I get to what is going on here? Excuse me a moment. Somehow slide got out of order, don't ask me how. That brings me now to the subject of urban legends, which if you heard Bruce's talk last week, some of these ought to go away. These are notions that may have found their way into local schedule rules or were just something somebody dreamed up and thought was true even though it wasn't. Urban legend number one, don't you dare use the wrong container or tag. So if you have a little rose, as we just defined, it has to go in the little container and it has to have the little tag, or vice versa for the big rose. And of course, we said that can upset the balance of proportion. And although, as I have emphasized, we don't mark down on the basis of the choice of container, it still can have a subliminal effect on our judging, because if we look at something and say, that just, and something in the back of our mind just is saying to us, there's something about that that just doesn't look right. That could bias us against that particular specimen, and that's not good. So again, to the extent that it's possible, it's nice to be flexible with use of containers. So to conclude, yes, balance of proportion is based on design considerations of physical, visual balance, scale, and proportion. And the exhibitor certainly has at least some control over the stem length. They can always shorten it. They can't make it longer, although now that stem on stem is not a disqualification, somebody might skillfully be able to use stem on stem to get wood into the water and be able to perhaps disguise with the wedging material the actual point where the stem on stem occurs and get a little extra length that way. Pretty much everything else about the specimen is controlled by Mother Nature, except maybe the broken leaf. So, but the exhibitor has the choice of what to exhibit. So you can look at a specimen and say it's so-so in some regard. Maybe I don't want to exhibit it, or maybe I do if I don't have a lot of roses and I'm not wasting time setting it up, and the show is going to be small and the audience thinks they're all beautiful anyway, even the ones with the white ribbons on them. So there's more to judging balance of proportion, and stem length is my final word here. So moving on to sprays, I want to consider the form of the spray and balance of proportion applied to sprays. The book tells us that the form of a good spray is a spray that has florets forming a circle or other symmetrical shape viewed from above. It has no gaps, such as the infamous hole in the middle resulting from removing a spent terminal floret. It has florets evenly distributed about the main stem. It has a uniform appearance when viewed from the side, and the florets may have a domed or flat profile. So we can assume that any departures from this make a spray not so good, maybe even bad, although we don't like to be negative. It doesn't really tell you why that's the case, and I want to explore that. So here, and before I go much farther, I don't have photographs except in one case toward the end. So because when you take pictures at a rose show, you take pictures of the winners, you don't take pictures of the things that have problems. So I'm using illustrations from the book and some illustrations I made for better or worse myself. So here are the two examples from the book, the top view and the side view of the spray. We've all seen them. So there's a circular outline on the left, there's the domed outline when viewed from the side on the right. So let's consider what I'm calling bad spray number one. And I've taken that view from the top and I've just whited out two of the roses. So pretend they're not there. So now instead of having an even distribution around the central point, which is this rose here, if you can see my pointer, they're skewed to one side. If we were to draw a line through the center here, all the roses are to the northeast, if you will, of that line. And what that means is that it's unbalanced visually and perhaps even physically if it's a big spray in a small container. So balance is the issue here. Now let's go to bad spray number 2. This is the infamous hole in the middle. Now why is that bad? Well, is it balanced? Not really, because it's still symmetrical, if symmetrical around the hole. We have this sort of donut or bagel of roses here. We have the hole in the middle. Why is it bad? Well, I'm saying it's because it stops the eye. That is to say, it grabs our attention and doesn't let go. If you look down on it, there's that hole. You might see some stems, and at the bottom of that, there might be a black disbudding scar because you didn't disbud it until the day before and it turned black. So, and of course, it didn't have time to fill in the gap. So how could we classify this problem then? Well, we have to go to another definition, and this is rhythm. A visual path through a spray or array of specimens, the placement of florets or specimens that carries the eye from one point to another, unifying the whole. When I first had to familiarize myself with this concept, I had a little trouble grabbing it. I think it's easier to, and of course, that's item number 4 on our list of design principles. So it's easier to say what good rhythm is not, what bad rhythm is, and to go from there. So first example of bad rhythm, well, it might be that bass player in your teenage grandson's garage band. And to continue the automotive analogy, I'm going to talk about something called a stop sign. And a stop sign is something like the hole in the middle of a spray, which attracts your attention and doesn't let go and prevents you from essentially taking in the rest of what it is you're supposed to be looking at. The other type is what I'm calling an exit ramp. And an exit ramp, like a wildly misplaced floret in a spray, which we'll see in a bit, is something which draws your attention away and out of what it is that you're supposed to be looking at. And before we go on to bad spray number 3, I think another way of looking at it is just like reading. If we read a page of text, at least if we're reading English or most other European languages, we start at the top and we proceed in an orderly fashion from top to bottom. We get to a period at the end of the page and we stop. But suppose after the first paragraph, the second paragraph is upside down and backward. Well, all of a sudden we get down to that and we're stopped dead. We have to shift gears and say, well, how can I take this in to actually then get to the bottom of the page? So that's another way of looking at it, at a rhythm issue. So here's bad spray number 3, which actually has 3 faults in it, which I've labeled 1, 2, and 3 in red. A real specimen might have only one of these at a time, and that's how I'm treating it. So flaw number 1, it's this flower below the main part of the spray. It's in an exit ramp. Maybe it kind of draws you down toward the ground or toward the table. Does it affect the balance? Maybe slightly, and you might not even see it so much if you look straight down on the spray. It's not a terrible flaw as flaws go. Certainly easily dealt with by the exhibitor simply by snipping it off. It would never be missed.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Never mind Siri, my watch is interrupting me. Flaw number 2 is, I think, more significant. If we look at it from the top, that rose is going to be in our face compared to the rest of the spray. You could say it's a stop sign because I might be fixated on that floret and not really get to the rest of the spray. If I look at it from the side, it could be an exit ramp because it's pointing straight up toward the sky and it's pulling me up and away from what it is I want to see. Could I repair that by taking it off? Well, maybe or maybe not, because that could create that hole in the middle. So that would be a bit of a dilemma. Number 3, certainly would affect the balance, because now you have the weight of the rows on long levers standing up there. That's going to skew the balance off to that side. Is it a stop sign? Yeah, you can think of it that way. I think of it more as an exit ramp, especially if it's leaning a bit more toward the table, because then what it's going to do is, when your eye reaches that, it's going to lead you right into whatever exhibit is sitting next to this one. So that's bad spray number 3. So balance and rhythm are really the major design factors that affect how we regard the form of a spray. A balance of proportion in regard to spray, getting back to the horticultural definition of balance of proportion. The book says not as much stem and foliage as is required to balance a spray is required to balance a solitary bloom, i.e. to achieve good proportion. Whether the overall appearance of an exhibitor pleasing or disturbing because of stem length and the density of the foliage or lack of it resides with the judge's sense of aesthetics. So there we are back again as saying that the judges have to become, in a sense, art critics to have the aesthetic sense to know what is pleasing and what is not. So let's bring in bad spray number 4, which is the candelabra. We've seen these, the spray of spray, and I committed the sin of taking one of these the first time I exhibited. When I had it on the table, it looked like I had brought half a rose bush instead of a spray. And not only that, the flowers had blown open on the trip into the show, so it got a yellow ribbon, and that was probably an act of mercy. But this is the spray of sprays. And you certainly risk physical imbalance, because if it's big enough, it's hard to find a container that has enough weight along with the water to actually stabilize the thing. To get the visual balance, you need a very long main stem, and again, that creates issues with the physical imbalance. And it's an issue of the scale of the specimen not necessarily matching the scale of the container, so there's a proportion problem coming up. And they also tend to have sparse foliage. Candelabras frequently occur on a basal break. Some basal breaks, they get about halfway to the length and they just stop creating leaves altogether. They start branching like crazy and blooming like crazy. It's just nice, it gives you a lot of flowers, but you have a lot of stem, a lot of flowers, very little foliage. And that's not too good either. So you can end up with this situation I just described, a lot of stem, including the branching, and then you're disproportionate with regard to the amount of foliage. Is there anything else we should be considering here? Well, what about space between florets? Space has scale. You can measure it and get the ruler, say how much space there is between the florets. Florets have scale, and the relationship between the two, the proportion can be significantly good or significantly off. If you have small florets with a lot of space between them, like you remember one situation I saw on a show once, the flowers are very small. In fact, they may have only been partially open buds. There was a lot of stem you could see, a lot of space, no foliage. And you got a proportion issue between the space and the florets. They look lost. You possibly have a rhythm issue because each floret can be a stop sign if the distance to the next one is so far that your eye doesn't really find its way over. The opposite situation, lack of space. You may have no breathing room. The whole exhibit may look like one large flower. And since you're supposed to judge the horticulture quality of each individual floret on the spray, that makes that life difficult if they're all jammed together that way. So concluding our talk on sprays, the evaluation of form of sprays involves design considerations, rhythm, and balance, as I mentioned. Balance of proportion, well, it's the same old thing. You consider the scale of the elements of the spray and whether they're in proper proportion, creating the sort of balance you like, the horticultural balance you like to see. And reminder from the book that acceptable scale and proportion may differ from that of a single bloom specimen. So moving on now to challenge classes. And the aspect of the challenge classes I'm really going to talk about is the so-called overall appearance factor. Now, when we judge challenge classes, the horticulture quality of the individual specimens, however they're displayed, is worth 80 points or 80% of the overall score of the exhibit. And then the remaining 20 points goes to the so-called overall appearance of the exhibit. And if you hadn't guessed by now, I'm going to claim that the overall appearance is nothing more than the design of the exhibit. And I also feel honor bound to say, and this is that when we judge arrangements, all the design stuff, the design, the conformance to the factors of the conformance of the schedule, the naming of the roses, the interpretation, the creativity, all that stuff is worth 70 points. And 30 points goes to the horticulture quality of the roses. So there's some parallelism there. They don't exactly equal each other, but the challenge class in horticulture has to have good design, and the arrangement in the arrangement division has to have good roses. At 30 points, if you have bad roses in an arrangement, it's not going to win. So let's define our last two items in the list of design principles. Dominance is the stronger effect of one or more component in an array of specimens to the others. Dominance is achieved through use of color, form, added size, and texture. Contrast is the use of unlike qualities of specimens in an array to emphasize their differences. Contrast may be found in form, color, texture, and size. Now, I'm going to fess up, these definitions are slightly reworded from the arrangement guidelines, so they might be a little awkward, but they certainly can be adapted to horticulture here. So dominance and contrast, they're the last two. We defined all six. Dominance and contrast, especially in challenge classes, they can be two-edged swords. They could be a good thing, but too much of them can be not good, because the goal in a challenge class very often is to achieve a degree of uniformity and not difference. So let's start with the English box class. Now, an English box ideally has flowers that are similar in size, and each variety has similar good form, good color, and good substance. And here's the first of my crude schematics you're going to see. So now you're looking down on a box with 6 sort of mauvey pink roses or whatever in there, and they're all the same size, they're all the same color. There's no form to them, obviously, and maybe I made the circles a little bit too small to be perfect, but that's the example. Now, perfection is not always attainable, and suppose there's some variation in size, and you have 2 a little smaller and 2 a little larger than the mean. Well, how do you achieve balance then? Well, there are different ways you could put them in the box, but you could put them with the small roses at the top and the larger roses at the bottom, or you could do it in the opposite sense, and yeah, you could scramble them, and I don't know that anybody would actually do that. I hope not, but on the left, we see the 2 largest roses, which all other factors being the same, I'm going to claim are dominant on the basis of size, and also on the basis of size having the most visual weight. So if the smaller roses are the least dominant and the least weighty visually, we go from top to bottom to light to heavy, whereas the opposite is true on the other side. Now, also, if you think of rhythm, when I talked about reading a page on the book, we read down to the period at the end where we're stopped. Well, the dominant roses are the ones that are going to stop us. So I would argue that the rhythm on the left was better than the rhythm on the right. So we have what I would call a balanced display on the left and an unbalanced display on the right. It just simply looks top heavy. It doesn't look right. Now, what about scale and proportion? Well, I have a shrub rose called Music Box, one of pink limbs. It's a very vigorous bush, but the flowers are small. They're maybe an inch and a half, thereabouts, so they're really mini flora size. But if the urban legend tells me that, well, it's a shrub is a big rose, and if there's a English box class that allows shrubs in it, I have to use the big box. Well, then I have, and I maybe didn't make these even small enough, I have small roses in a big box. So the scale established by the roses clashes with the scale established by the size of the box. The proportion is off. Now suppose I have 6 big mini floras. Lady Aowen comes to mind. She's not this pink color, but the urban legend says, well, you have to, they're little roses, you have to use the little rose box. Well, now I have 6 of these crammed together. So once again, the scale of the roses does not correspond to the scale of the box, and the proportion is wrong. So we have big roses in a little box. That doesn't work either. Now, my society had a good idea, is that we commissioned some boxes that were intermediate in size between a hybrid tea size box and a miniature rose size box. And that worked out very well. So that's a suggestion that if you're accommodating wider classes of roses in English boxes in your shows, that having more of a range of size of boxes is helpful to the exhibitor and helpful to the judges in not being distracted by these supposedly unavoidable proportion issues. Now, let's throw color in there, and how does that affect balance, dominance, and contrast? So here's our 2 boxes again. Now I've gone back to having them the same size, but I have 2 red roses, I have 2 of these Moby pinks, and I have 2 that are supposed to be white, but either by optical illusion or some quirk of PowerPoint, they look a little greenish like the background. I'm going to also say that the red is a vivid red, not a very dark or dull red, and that therefore the red is a dominant color and carries the visual weight with it. So once again, how do you manage that? Well, the dominant color now has the visual weight, so gravity says the heaviest weight goes to the bottom, and I would say then that the one on the right is better balanced than the one on the left. Now, size differences could come into that too, and ultimately, I think what I would say to exhibitors is to find the best way to manage balance, dominance, and contrast is to play with the roses, which is easy enough to do in an English box. You keep swapping them out until you find what is the right combination to enter into the show. That's what my Ikebana teacher says all the time when you're puzzled with trying to figure out how to arrange something. She says, well, play with it. So that's a possibility. So we have dominance on the basis of color rather than size, and I suggest that having the dominant color as a stopping point is the best way to manage that. Rose bowl, quickly, the same situation can happen. Big rose in a small bowl, small rose in a big bowl because of urban legends. So the outline represents the bowl, the blue represents the water. I have a big mini flora and a miniature rose bowl. There's hardly any water visible. Maybe even the petals are hanging on the edge. I have a scale and proportion issue, not as pleasing to the eye. The other way of looking at it is I have my little music box or a rose de resh rose and a big bowl that's designed for a large hybrid tea. There's a lot of water. There isn't very much rose. So again, the scale and proportion are issues. Notice that I have the rose off center. Why is that? Because when you put a little rose in a big bowl of water, I have never seen one that stayed in the center. All you need is an air current from somebody walking by and it drifts away. I liken that to trying to spot a lifeboat in the ocean from the window of an airplane. It's just doesn't look good, and it's thoroughly avoidable if you put that small rose in the smaller bowl. So again, if a range of size of bowls is available, the exhibitor should take note of that, use whatever is appropriate, and I think the judges should give some bit of an award for making the proper choice on the container as well. Cycle of bloom in one container I want to touch on briefly. I know one district in particular, who I shall not name, insists on the cycle of bloom being displayed in one container. And as far as my memory serves me, that they also want the open bloom to be on the longest stem, saying that that's the most mature rose in the set. Therefore, it should be on the longest stem. Well, I'm starting to repeat myself. Now you have the large dominant by size rose in the most prominent and top heavy position. And I've tried to represent that with these schematics. I'm not sure that really does it justice, but the small rose, the bud really should be on top, and the more dominant open bloom rose as the lower of the three. Now these are probably exaggerated in terms of both the size and the position, and you probably wouldn't have them side by side like this in any event, but not having photos was the best I could do. And there's always an exception to the rule too, and that's the high-low, and I didn't make a slide on that, but high-low, no matter what you do, it's going to look unbalanced because you have the large rose on its long stem and the small rose on a short stem, and no matter how you display them, the large rose is going to just tower over and dominate the small rose. Now we get the bulk collections, and I have an actual picture here so that we can talk about. This is the Seville bull winner exhibited by Satish and Vijaya Prabhu at the miniature show in 2011. It's a lovely display, but now we can talk about how you would look at that from saying how would you evaluate the overall appearance of this. So first of all, I got to admit, this is the closest thing to an actual arrangement that you're going to see in the horticulture division. Now, these are roses in a shallow bowl with oasis or some other floral foam in it, and they have to be inserted in that the same way if you were making a mass arrangement. So it's getting awfully close. But to evaluate the overall appearance, we can apply the design principles. Balance. Again, if you see my pointer going left, or if I draw a line, vertical line, the left to right balance is excellent. If I draw the line horizontally, it's also very good. The only question I have is these two roses here, which will look a little smaller than the two above them. It's difficult, if not impossible, to really make judgments on a photograph as opposed to the actual exhibit, but possibly, you know, they could have been swapped, but that's a small issue. So balance is fine. Scale, of course, the roses are all about the same size. The foliage is the appropriate size. They're all good miniature roses. Likewise, the proportion, you see roses, but you also have a nice display of the excellent foliage in between. The other three factors: rhythm, contrast, and dominance. And this gets interesting, because there are 18 roses in this exhibit. 16 of them, I would say, are in the same color range, and then you have these two yellow roses down at the bottom. Well, certainly the yellow roses make contrast with the rest of them. Yellow is a very standout color. That's why school buses are painted yellow, why safety vests are yellow. Yellow is a really attention-grabbing color. So you have not only contrast from the yellow, but you also have dominance. So as we said before, having the dominant roses at the bottom of the page is an excellent idea, and I would say that that's the ideal place to put the two yellow roses. I don't doubt that they had two more in the same color range as the other 16. They would have used them, but not having that, putting these dominant roses in the least dominant spot, so that if you read it top to bottom, that's your period at the end. Now, if you tried to put them elsewhere, say put one over here, that would be not good at all, because now you would have two exit ramps leading to either the right or to the left, or whoever's exhibit might have been sitting to one side or the other. And if you say, well, let's put them in the middle, that would have been the worst thing of all, because that would create what we would call a bullseye, and your eye would go right to those yellow roses and never move. So hats off to them. I do know that Vijaya is an excellent arranger. She has won national arrangement trophies in her own right. So they're very good at doing this. Finally, just to finish up, you get to the arrays, which are the multi-container challenge classes. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on it. I know I've been flogging this horse for the better part of an hour, and he's getting pretty sore. But when you have a number of containers, there are many possible ways to array them, like on the row, the column, the arch, the square, the bowling pins. You probably can visualize all those very easily. The plus sign I'll tell a little story about, and etc. There might be more than even some could think of. So how you choose that, well, some of them may depend on how many roses. If you have a cycle of bloom of 3 containers, you know, or 5 containers like a district fire one, you can put them in a row, you can put them in a column, that usually is fine. If you have, say, a top gun or something with 10, the archway where you arrange them that way might be a good way to do it. Or you have the bowling pins, you know, you have a row of 4 with 3 in front of that, 2 in front of that, and 1 in front. Square, maybe for a Nicholson, that's 9 roses, 3 by 3 would be one possibility. But the overall decision is to display them in a way that maximizes their quality and minimizes their faults. So you have to consider balance in terms of the size of the roses, the color of the roses, the scale, how you manage the size differences. You know, you like it in challenge classes to have roses all about the same size, not always possible, maybe not all the same stem lengths. So if you have an arrangement that puts the taller, larger ones in the back and the smaller, shorter stem roses in the front, that's a way to manage that. Rhythm, be careful about how you progress your colors so that you essentially, to be musical, you have like a crescendo and diminuendo, going from soft to loud to soft again, or vice versa, loud to soft to loud again, rather than scrambled where you have interruptions in how you do it. And of course, dominance and contrast, too much of those can be a good thing, and you want to deal with that in a way that doesn't disturb the rhythm. The plus sign story, I'm thinking back to a district fire one exhibit at the Penn Jersey district a few years ago, and that an excellent exhibitor of hybrid teas had entered and won. And he had the roses set up so that if you imagine a clock space, one was at the center of the face, and the other 4 roses were at 12, 3, 6, and 9 o'clock. And they were fairly close together, so the foliage more or less overlapped. So we looked at it, the roses were beautiful. I certainly said it was the winner, and so did the other judges that won. Then somebody asked the exhibitor why he had arranged them in that particular fashion. And it turned out that one of the roses, and I think the one in the middle, actually was missing a leaf. So by arranging them in that fashion and putting them fairly close together, the overlap of the foliage totally disguised the fact that the leaf was missing. So that was a case of maximizing the quality and minimizing the faults by being clever as to how you set up the exhibit. So conclusions on challenge classes. Overall appearance is really design. I think we've established that by now. Design principles provide a framework for judging and exhibiting. I think we've established that by now. So what didn't I realize? Going back to my cryptic title. I didn't realize before I became an arrangement judge that design is a significant consideration in horticulture exhibiting and judging. And I didn't realize that I have now, and you have been applying design principles all along, even if you weren't doing it consciously. If you're a good judge, you're a good exhibitor, in the back of your mind, those conditions are operating in terms of your success as a judge and your success as an exhibitor. And I also want to claim that with this in mind, that the gulf between the horticultural and arrangement divisions may not be so wide after all. So before I stop, I want to pose one last question. Which of these would you want the neighbors to see in your driveway? This Lamborghini or this Pacer? This is where the thank you slide is supposed to come in. And I'm now open to, I'll try and find that and